October 1944. Hürtgen Forest, Germany, 200 a.m. A 22-year-old American kid from Kansas is bleeding out in the mud. A .30 caliber round punched clean through his shoulder 3 minutes ago. His name is Tommy Sullivan. He's lying face down in a puddle of his own blood while German mortar rounds walk through the trees like the footsteps of God. The forest is on fire. Tracers cut red lines through the darkness. 12 Americans walked into this forest an hour ago. 3 of them are already dead. 5 more will never fight again. And every single one of them is dying because one gunshot was too loud. Here is the number that should terrify you. In the fall of 1944, American infantry patrols operating behind German lines suffered a 40% casualty rate on stealth missions. Not because the soldiers were bad, not because the plans were flawed. Because every weapon in the United States arsenal made enough noise to wake the dead and the Germans within 2 miles. One trigger pull, one muzzle flash, one thunderclap of expanding gas, and an entire squad of trained killers became sitting ducks in seconds. But a mechanic from West Virginia was about to change that. Using nothing but a truck oil filter, a welding torch, and a promise he made to a dead man's widow. His name was Jack Monroe. He never made the history books. He never received a medal. And the United States Army told him his idea was insane. They banned it, laughed at it, threatened to court-martial him for building it. Then that same invention took a bridge without waking the guards, saved an entire armored division, and quietly influenced suppressor technology for the next 80 years. This is the true story of how a piece of garage trash changed World War II. To understand what Jack Monroe built in a German motor pool in 1944, you need to understand what he lost in a West Virginia coal mine in 1938. Charleston, West Virginia. March 1938. Jack was 24 years old running his father's garage on the edge of town. Monroe Auto Repair. A corrugated metal building with 2 bays surrounded by the skeletons of dead trucks and towers of salvaged parts. Nothing fancy. But Robert Monroe, Jack's father, had built a reputation in that garage. 52 years old, hands like industrial clamps, a back bent from 3 decades of crawling under engines. He'd escaped the coal mines in 1920, decided breathing oil fumes beat breathing coal dust, and taught his son everything. How to diagnose an engine by sound alone. How to rebuild a transmission with parts from 3 different vehicles. How to solve problems that other people declared impossible. On a Tuesday morning in March, Robert kissed his wife goodbye and went underground. He still worked occasional shifts in the mines when money got tight. His brother ran a crew. Easy money. 8 hours. Come home. He never came home. The ventilation system in the number 7 shaft had been failing for weeks. The mining company knew. They had reports. They had complaints from every man who worked that tunnel. But ventilation repairs cost money, and money meant lower profits, so they filed the complaints in a drawer and sent men underground into a tunnel filling with methane. 1 spark from a pickaxe. That was all it took. The explosion killed 17 men. Robert Monroe died 200 feet below the surface of a state that would never hold anyone accountable for his death. Tommy Sullivan's father died beside him. The investigation was theater. The company paid the right people. The official report called it an unavoidable tragedy. 17 widows received settlements that barely covered coffin costs. And Jack Monroe, standing at his father's grave at 24 years old, learned the lesson that would define his life. Bad equipment kills good men. Good equipment saves them. And if the people in charge refuse to provide good equipment, then someone else has to build it. Jack ran the garage alone for 4 years. Married Sarah Parker in 1941. Then Pearl Harbor happened, and Jack Monroe found a new purpose. He enlisted in June 1942. And his neighbor, Tommy Sullivan, the youngest son of Margaret Sullivan, the widow from that same mine collapse, enlisted with him. Margaret was in her 50s, thin, exhausted from raising 6 children alone on a coal company pension that was an insult dressed as charity. Tommy was her last hope, her youngest, her baby. When Jack told her he was enlisting, and Tommy wanted to go too, she grabbed his hand. Her grip was iron. Her voice was steady despite the tears. She said 7 words that would haunt Jack Monroe for the next 3 years. "Jack Monroe, you bring my boy home." Then 5 more. "I already lost his father." And 4 final ones that settled on Jack's shoulders like concrete. "I can't lose Tommy." Jack looked at Tommy, 20 years old, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning, excited about the adventure, completely unaware that war doesn't care about excitement. Jack made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. "On my father's grave, Mrs. Sullivan. I'll bring Tommy home." That promise was easy in the sunshine of a West Virginia summer. It became something else entirely in a German forest, with Tommy's blood soaking through Jack's uniform. October 1944. 3rd Armored Division Motor Pool. Somewhere in occupied Germany. Jack had earned his sergeant stripes by being older, steadier, and more mechanically gifted than anyone else in his unit. He ran the motor pool, kept tanks rolling, kept trucks moving, kept the gears of war turning with spit and baling wire and sheer stubbornness. Nobody wrote home about the mechanic who changed oil filters at 3 o'clock a.m. But armies move on wheels, and Jack Monroe kept those wheels spinning. Tommy had recovered from the shoulder wound he took in the forest. 6 weeks in a field hospital, 4 weeks of light duty, then back with the division, still grinning, still treating the whole thing like a grand adventure, still trusting Jack to keep him alive. The failed patrol ate at Jack like acid. 3 dead, 5 wounded, mission destroyed. All because a Thompson submachine gun turned a stealth operation into a fireworks show. And lying under a deuce-and-a-half truck 2 days later, up to his elbows in oil. Jack Monroe looked at the cylindrical oil filter mounted on the engine block, and his entire world shifted. An engine creates an explosion in a cylinder. Gas expands, drives a piston. When that gas exits through the exhaust, it creates a shock wave. That is noise. A muffler traps that gas in chambers. Baffles break up the pressure wave. The explosion becomes a whisper. A gun works exactly the same way. Powder burns. Gas expands, bullet flies, gas hits open air at the muzzle, shockwave, bang. Every German in 2 miles knows you are there. Jack stared at that oil filter and thought the thought that changed everything. If baffles silence a truck engine, why not a rifle? He pulled a used filter from the scrap pile, 6 inches long, 4 inches across. Mesh baffles inside. Cotton packing compressed and oil-soaked but functional. He welded a threaded washer to the back. Cut matching threads into the barrel of an M3 grease gun. 4 hours of obsessive work in the lamplight of the motor pool while everyone else slept. The first test was a disaster. Jack fired 1 round and the filter split open like a tin can. The welds were too thin. The cotton too loose. The baffles unsecured. The shot was deafening. The wooden target 50 yards downrange remained untouched, and a dozen officers who had gathered to watch laughed until tears ran down their faces. Lieutenant Morrison, West Point graduate and ordained believer in the Church of Regulation, delivered the eulogy. "I told you it would explode. Mechanics should stick to fixing trucks. Leave weapon design to professionals." Jack stood there holding the ruined filter, ears ringing, arms aching. Every officer looking at him like the village idiot. But Jack Monroe was not thinking about the laughter. He was thinking about the 3 seconds before the filter failed. Because in those 3 seconds, the gun had fired, the bolt had cycled, and for 1 instant, the filter had absorbed the blast. Not all of it, not enough, but some. Which meant the physics worked. The engineering just needed to be better. 3 nights. That is how long it took. Jack rebuilt the filter from scratch in the dark corner of the motor pool office with Sarah's letter on the desk beside him. Reinforced the canister with welded support ribs. Triple pass welds on every seam. Cotton packed so tight it barely compressed. Mesh baffles secured with through bolts, drilled and threaded by hand. Every measurement checked twice. Every weld tested by feel and by eye. He tested it at dawn, alone. No audience this time. The grease gun fired. The bolt slammed forward, and the sound that came out was not a gunshot. It was a heavy pneumatic cough, a mechanical thud, a sharp hiss of trapped gas escaping through cotton and mesh, like a book dropping on a thick carpet. He fired again. Same sound. 10-round burst. The filter smoked, the paint blistered, but the welds held. Downrange, the wooden post sprouted splinters. It worked. A mechanic from West Virginia, using garbage from a scrap pile and skills learned in his dead father's garage, had just built a functional suppressor for a submachine gun. Jack took it to Colonel Harrison. Full demonstration at noon. 30-round magazine. The officers stared. Staff Sergeant Mike Dawson, the squad leader who had survived the failed forest patrol, straightened like he had been electrocuted. Morrison went pale. Harrison examined the bullet holes, watched a full auto burst, listened to the muffled mechanical cough that replaced the deafening crack. Then he said the words that hit Jack like a sledgehammer to the chest. "Sergeant, this is remarkable work, but I cannot authorize its use. Violation of regulations. Untested by ordnance. Unknown failure modes." The colonel ordered Jack to remove the device and return the weapon to standard configuration. The silencer was banned. Jack unscrewed the filter in front of the colonel, carried it back to the motor pool wrapped in an oily rag, did not throw it away, tucked it into the bottom of his duffel bag, because Jack Monroe knew something the colonel did not. Somewhere ahead of them was a bridge, and knives would not be enough to take it. 2 days later, the orders came. A river crossing, the Rower River. Single bridge still standing in the sector. Germans had wired it with enough explosives to drop the entire structure into the water. Demolition team in a bunker on the far side. Detonator ready. One sign of American armor or artillery, one loud noise, one single gunshot, and the bridge would vanish. The 3rd Armored Division needed that bridge intact. Without it, the advance stopped cold. 3 weeks of planning, thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, all dependent on one steel span across dark water. Harrison's plan was knives. Silent approach. Crawl across the bridge supports. Kill the sentries by hand. Storm the bunker. Cut the wires. 12 volunteers for what every man in the room recognized as a suicide mission. Tommy Sullivan raised his hand before Jack could stop him. Jack's heart dropped through the floor, but he stood up anyway, because a promise is a promise, and Jack Monroe was his father's son. That night, Jack pulled the banned oil filter from his duffel bag, screwed it onto the grease gun, felt it seat with a satisfying click. Harrison had forbidden it. Regulations condemned it. Using it meant court-martial disgrace, everything a soldier feared. But 3 Americans had died in a forest because their weapons were too loud, and Jack Monroe had sworn on his father's grave to bring Tommy Sullivan home alive. Regulations or promises? Career or conscience? The rulebook or the right thing? Jack Monroe chose the oil filter. What happened on that bridge at 0100 hours would prove that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in war is not a tank or a bomber or an artillery battery. It is a mechanic who refuses to let his best friend die. A man with a piece of garbage and a promise he intends to keep. But that story begins in the rain in the dark, with 12 Americans crawling toward a bridge rigged to explode, and one illegal weapon that was either going to save them all or get every single one of them killed. That story is part 2. A mechanic built a silencer from a truck oil filter. The Army banned it, laughed at it, ordered him to destroy it. But Jack Monroe hid that piece of garbage in his duffel bag because 12 men had just volunteered to take a bridge with knives, and his best friend Tommy Sullivan was one of them. Here is the number that should keep you awake tonight. In October 1944, the success rate of knife-only assault missions against fortified German positions was 11%. 11. That means for every 10 squads sent in silent with blades, 9 came back in body bags. Colonel Harrison knew this number. Every officer in the 3rd Armored Division knew this number. And they sent 12 men anyway because there was no other option. No artillery, no air support, No suppressed weapons. Just knives against sentries with machine guns and a bridge wired with enough TNT to erase it from the map. And this is where everything got worse. The night before the assault, Jack Monroe sat in the motor pool office writing a letter to his wife. The pen shook in his hand, not from cold, from the weight of what he was about to do. Dear Sarah, if you are reading this, I did not make it back. He wrote about the baby coming in December, about the garage, about the promise he made to Margaret Sullivan, about the oil filter he was going to carry onto that bridge in direct violation of a colonel's order. He sealed the envelope, called Tommy over. If I do not make it, get this to Sarah. Tommy handed Jack his own letter. For my ma. Two men exchanging their last words on paper. Two kids from West Virginia who had grown up as neighbors, lost their fathers in the same mine explosion, enlisted together, survived Normandy together, and now stood on the edge of a mission that military statistics said would kill most of them. Jack pulled the oil filter from his duffel bag, unwrapped the oily rag. The scorched metal gleamed dull under the lamplight. Tommy stared at it. Jack, the colonel banned that thing. The colonel is not crossing that bridge. We are. Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked what Jack needed. Trust me, do not tell anyone until we are on that bridge. I can do that. Tommy gripped his shoulder. Your dad would be proud. But Jack still had a problem. Big Mike Dawson was running the mission. Staff sergeant, 35 years old, Chicago cop before the war. The kind of man who had seen enough violence to know the difference between a Hollywood knife fight and the real thing where trained sentries do not stand still with their backs turned. If Big Mike reported the unauthorized weapon, Jack would be arrested before he reached the river. Big Mike appeared in the doorway. His eyes went straight to the grease gun on the desk, the oil filter beside it. He was not stupid. He had been at the demonstration. He knew what Harrison had ordered. That what I think it is, Jack met his gaze. Depends on what you think it is. I think it is a mechanic who is tired of watching men die. Big Mike walked to the desk, picked up the filter, felt its weight. I was on that patrol, the one where Jensen and Martinez and Williams got killed. I remember the sound of that Thompson lighting up like a firework. Every German in the sector knew exactly where we were. He set the filter down. And now Harrison wants us to take a bridge with knives, against sentries with MG-42s. That is not tactics. That is a prayer. So what are you saying? I am saying if you happen to bring that thing tomorrow, and if it happens to work, I am not asking questions. But Monroe. Big Mike's face went hard as concrete. If it fails, if it gets my men killed, I will make sure your court-martial is the least of your problems. Crystal clear. The briefing that night was controlled chaos. 12 men in a supply tent, hand-drawn maps, aerial photos. Big Mike laid it out cold. River here, bridge here, German bunker far side. Intelligence says 2 sentries near end. Machine gun nest at midpoint. Demolition team in the bunker, with enough explosives to drop the whole structure. The plan was knives and speed. Cross at 0-100. Low crawl across the supports. Kill sentries silent. Rush the bunker before they react. Green flare means success. Main armored column crosses at 0330. If the flare does not go up by 0300, the tanks advance anyway, which means you are caught between American armor and German defensive positions. Jack raised his hand. What if we had a way to eliminate the sentries without alerting the bunker? The tent went silent. Jack unwrapped the grease gun. The oil filter gleamed under lamplight. The room exploded. Men shouting, some laughing. Lieutenant Morrison pushing forward, face red, voice cracking. Monroe, Colonel Harrison, banned that device. This is insubordination. Sergeant Dawson, I am ordering you to confiscate that weapon and place Monroe under arrest. Belay that. Big Mike's voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a razor. Sir, I am in command of this mission, and I say we use every tool available to complete it. Morrison sputtered. This is against regulations. So is sending men to die because we are too stubborn to adapt. Big Mike did not blink. "Sir, you want to court Marshal Monroe after the mission, fine. But let him try to save lives first. Because I am not telling mothers their sons died because we followed regulations instead of using our brains." Morrison backed down, but his words hung in the air like smoke. "This is on your head, Dawson, yours and Monroe's. 0100 hours. October 21st, 1944. Cold rain turning the world to mud. 12 Americans moved out into darkness so complete you could not see your own hand at arm's length. The sound of rain on leaves created white noise. Perfect cover for footsteps. Useless cover for gunfire. Which was why Jack Monroe carried 3 pounds of scorched metal and burnt cotton, screwed to the end of a grease gun that the United States Army had explicitly forbidden him to use. They reached the river at 1:45. The bridge materialized from the darkness like a steel skeleton. 200 feet of black girders spanning black water. Explosive charges visible even in the dark. Boxes strapped to support pylons. Wires running to the roadbed. One electrical current. One German hand on one detonator. That was all it took to erase the 3rd Armored Division's entire advance. Near end of the bridge. Single sentry. Rubber raincoat glistening. Rifle slung over his shoulder. Walking an irregular pattern. 3 steps. Stop. Turn. 4 steps. Stop. Look around. No rhythm. No predictability. Impossible to approach with a knife without being seen. Big Mike crawled beside Jack, whispered directly into his ear. Sentry is not following a pattern, cannot predict when his back is turned. I can take him. How far? 40 yards. Maybe 45. That is a long shot with no sights. It will work. Big Mike hesitated. 1 heartbeat. 2. This was everything. Trust the mechanic's trash can invention or send men with knives against an alert sentry with an automatic weapon. You get 1 shot, Monroe. He goes down quiet or the whole mission is blown. The sentry stopped, reached into his coat, pulled out cigarettes, struck a match. Orange flare in the darkness. A face appeared. Young, maybe 20. Trying to light a cigarette in the rain. Hands cupped around the flame, eyes down. 10 seconds of stillness. Jack went prone in the mud, elbows braced, grease gun heavy and nose down from the filter weight. No sights. The canister blocked everything. He had to aim by instinct. Point the ugly silhouette of the filter at the center of the German's raincoat. Trust his eye. Trust the physics. Trust 3 nights of obsessive welding in lamplight. He took a breath. Let half out. Squeezed the trigger. The bolt slammed forward. The gun lurched. And the sound that came out was not a gunshot. A heavy pneumatic cough. A mechanical thud. A sharp hiss of trapped gas. 40 yards away, the German sentry felt a sledgehammer hit his chest. The .45 caliber slug punched through raincoat Rib's heart. He dropped the cigarette, dropped the match, folded in half, collapsed onto wet pavement without a sound, dead before he hit the ground. Silence. Rain on steel, water rushing below. No alarm, no shouts, no muzzle flashes. Nothing. Big Mike's mouth hung open. Holy God. It worked. The squad sprinted forward, low and fast. Jack leading with the smoking grease gun. Halfway across the bridge, the machine gun nest, sandbags, tarp overhead. 2 Germans sitting on ammunition crates. 1 smoking, 1 drinking from a canteen. Both facing the American side. Both expecting an attack from that direction. Neither one looked behind them. Jack closed to 15 yards. Raise the grease gun. No sights. Point and trust. First shot. The bolt crashed home. Sharp exhale of trapped gas. The German on the left slumped sideways off his crate. The second German started to turn. Mouth opening. Jack shifted aim 3 feet right. Fired again. The second man collapsed onto the ammunition belt. His canteen fell, clattered against the wooden deck. That sound echoed across the bridge. In the bunker on the far side, a light flickered on. Move. Big Mike's hiss was urgent. No more stealth. Pure speed now. 12 men sprinting across a bridge rigged to explode. Jack reached the bunker first. Stone structure built into the bridge abutment. Heavy door slightly ajar. Yellow light spilling out. He pushed the door open with the smoking filter barrel. Inside. A German captain sat at a table writing in a logbook. Balding, reading glasses, Luger pistol beside a coffee cup. The officer looked up, saw the muddy American, saw the weapon that looked like industrial equipment. His hand darted for the Luger. Jack did not hesitate, squeezed the trigger. The bolt slammed, the sharp exhale. The captain fell forward onto his logbook. Coffee spilled across the map of the bridge. A dark stain spreading over the demolition points he would never detonate. Jack ripped the telephone cord from the wall, found the detonator box, smashed it on the floor, stomped the mechanism until wires tore free from terminals. The bridge was safe. But headlights appeared on the German side, a supply truck coming down the road. 20 seconds out, if the driver saw dead sentries or American uniforms, 50 Germans sleeping in a farmhouse 200 yards away would pour out with machine guns. Jack ran to the roadside ditch. Crouched. The filter was burning now, smoke pouring from vents, paint completely gone. Cotton inside turning to ash. Maybe 2 shots left before total failure. The truck rounded the curve. Headlights blinding. Jack aimed at the driver through the windshield glare. No sights. Pure instinct. Fired. The sound was louder now. The filter dying. But the bullet punched through glass hit the driver in the chest. The truck swerved into the ditch. Metal crunching. Glass shattering. A passenger stumbled out, dazed, reaching for a rifle. Jack stepped from the shadows. Fired his last suppressed round. The German dropped into the mud. The filter was finished. Glowing red. Baffles melted to slag. Cotton ash. Jack unscrewed it and tossed it into the ditch water where it landed with a hiss. 50 rounds. 6 kills. 0 noise that sounded like gunfire. 1 bridge intact. 1 armored division's advance preserved. The farmhouse woke anyway from the truck crash. Germans poured out. But it was too late. Big Mike's men had the captured MG-42 repositioned, and the rumble of Sherman tanks was already shaking the ground. The lead tank Iron Horse rounded the curve with its 75mm cannon and erased the farmhouse in a single shot. The 3rd Armored Division rolled across the Rower River that morning. Every tank, every half-track, every supply truck. Thousands of tons of American steel crossing a bridge that should have been rubble at the bottom of a river. German defensive lines collapsed because the enemy expected the bridge to blow. When it did not, their entire strategy disintegrated. Colonel Harrison climbed out of his tank, walked past dead sentries, past the smashed detonator, past prisoners being rounded up. He found Jack Monroe standing by the ditch, muddy, exhausted, holding the ruined oil filter he had fished from the water. A piece of glowing, warped, melted garbage that had just changed the course of an armored offensive. Harrison took the filter, felt the heat radiating from it, looked at the welds that had held under 50 rounds of sustained fire. His voice was gruff. This was, "Sergeant Monroe, get yourself a new filter. We have more bridges to cross." Jack blinked. "Sir, and Monroe." Harrison paused. "Next time you disobey a direct order, make sure it works." It was not an apology. It was not a medal. It was a colonel admitting that a mechanic with a welding torch had done what West Point said was impossible. Word spread through the ranks like wildfire. Mechanics talk. Soldiers tell stories. Within a week, motor pools across the European theater were pulling oil filters off trucks and heating up welding torches. Most attempts failed. Wrong filter types. Bad welds. Loose baffles. One private in the 1st Infantry lost 2 fingers when a poorly constructed canister ruptured. Command issued stern memos about unauthorized weapon modifications. But the idea was alive now. Unstoppable. The American GI had seen what was possible, and no memo from headquarters was going to make them forget. Lieutenant Morrison, The man who had laughed loudest at Jack's first failure found him the next morning, offered a cigarette, lit it for him. His voice was quiet. "I was wrong about the filter. About you. I thought engineers in Washington knew everything. Turns out a mechanic in a motor pool knows some things they do not." Then Morrison said something that mattered more than any medal. "I am writing a report about the bridge. I am not mentioning your device specifically, but I am noting that suppressed fire was critical to mission success." That report went up the chain, quietly, officially, into channels where people who made decisions would read it and start asking questions about noise reduction technology and tactical suppressors, and whether the concept a sergeant had proven with garbage could be engineered into something the entire military could use. Tommy Sullivan went home. Medical discharge. The bullet had grazed his thigh on the bridge, missing the femoral artery by less than an inch. Jack rode with him to the airstrip, held his hand in the half-track while medics worked, watched the transport plane climb into gray November sky, carrying his best friend back to Kansas, back to Margaret Sullivan, back to the life Jack had promised to protect. He had kept his word. On his father's grave, on Margaret Sullivan's front porch, in a German forest, on a bridge rigged to explode. Jack Monroe had brought Tommy home. But the war was not over. More bridges lay ahead. More rivers to cross. More German positions wired to blow at the first sound of American weapons. And now, Jack Monroe had a new problem. The 3rd Armored was advancing 60 miles in 3 weeks faster than anyone projected, and every bridge in their path posed the same question. How do you take a fortified position without making a sound? Jack had proven the answer once, with one filter, on one bridge, for 50 rounds. But the Germans were adapting. Intelligence reports showed enemy forces doubling bridge garrisons, adding listening posts, installing trip flares. They had heard rumors about silent American weapons, and they were terrified of what they could not understand. The next bridge would not be guarded by a single board sentry lighting a cigarette in the rain. The next bridge would be a fortress, and Jack Monroe's oil filter had exactly 0 rounds left before it melted into slag. He needed more filters, more time, more ammunition, and he needed the one thing the United States Army was least willing to give a sergeant who had already disobeyed a direct order: permission. In Part 3, the war comes to Jack Monroe. The Germans put a bounty on the silent American weapon. Command demands Jack reproduce his invention at scale, and a bridge twice the size of the Rower Crossing stands between the 3rd Armored and victory, guarded by a garrison that knows they are coming. The stakes just doubled. The enemy just adapted. And Jack Monroe has nothing left but empty filters and a promise that the next one will work. The real war is just beginning. A mechanic from West Virginia built a silencer from a truck oil filter. The Army banned it. He used it anyway. Took a bridge without waking the guards. Saved an armored division. Proved that garbage from a scrap pile could do what West Point engineers said was impossible. Colonel Harrison went from threatening court-martial to telling Jack Monroe to get himself a new filter. The 3rd Armored Division was advancing 60 miles in 3 weeks across German-occupied territory, and every bridge in their path needed to be taken silent. But here is the number nobody saw coming. Within 72 hours of the Rower River crossing, German intelligence intercepted field reports describing a silent American weapon capable of eliminating sentries without alerting garrisons. By day 5, Wehrmacht Command issued an emergency directive to every bridge garrison in the western sector. Double the guards. Install trip flares. Deploy listening posts at 300-meter intervals. Shoot anything that moves after dark. No exceptions. The Germans were terrified of something they could not see, could not hear, and could not understand. And they were about to make Jack Monroe's life significantly harder. German reaction was swift and brutal. Field Marshal Model's headquarters received the intelligence summary on October 26, 1944. 5 days after the Rower Bridge fell. The report described an unknown American noise suppression device capable of firing standard ammunition with minimal acoustic signature. The Germans did not know it was built from a truck oil filter. They assumed it was a classified weapons system developed by American Ordnance Laboratories. Something advanced. Something engineered. Something that meant the rules of nighttime defense had fundamentally changed. The response was immediate. Every bridge garrison west of the Rhine received new standing orders within 48 hours. Guard rotations cut from 4-hour shifts to 90 minutes. No sentry was to patrol alone. All guards carried signal flares in addition to weapons. Tripwire flares installed at 50-meter intervals on every bridge approach. Listening posts equipped with directional microphones positioned 300 meters from bridge perimeters. Machine gun nests relocated from fixed positions to rotating emplacements that changed location every 2 hours. The cost was enormous. Doubling bridge garrisons pulled approximately 8,000 combat troops from frontline positions across the Western Theater. 8,000 soldiers reassigned from fighting to standing guard because one mechanic with a welding torch had proven that the old way of defending bridges no longer worked. German defensive lines thinned. Reserve units shrank. The Wehrmacht was bleeding manpower into static defense because they could not solve the problem of an enemy they could not hear coming. But the increased security created a new nightmare for Jack Monroe. The Rower Bridge had been guarded by 3 sentries and a demolition team of 4. Standard garrison. Predictable. Vulnerable. The next target, a rail bridge over the Indie River 12 miles northeast, had been reinforced to 26 soldiers. 4 machine gun nests. Overlapping fields of fire. Trip flares on every approach. A listening post with a field telephone hardwired to an artillery battery 2 kilometers behind the lines. Taking that bridge silent was no longer a matter of one man with one suppressed weapon picking off isolated sentries. It required a coordinated assault with multiple suppressed firearms operating simultaneously. And Jack Monroe had exactly one working oil filter silencer, the one he had rebuilt after the Rower crossing. 50 rounds before failure, against 26 defenders. But that was not the only problem. The week after the Rower Bridge, 3 soldiers in other units attempted to build their own oil filter suppressors. They had heard the stories, gotten the basic idea, found filters and welding torches, and tried to replicate what Jack had done. 2 of the 3 attempts failed catastrophically. Private First Class Raymond Torres of the 1st Infantry Division used a filter from a light utility vehicle. Too thin, too small. The canister ruptured on the second round, sending metal fragments into his right hand. He lost 2 fingers and was evacuated stateside. Corporal Dennis Webb of the 9th Armored used proper welds but failed to secure the internal baffles. The first round tore the mesh loose inside the canister. The second round hit the displaced baffle and ricocheted. The bullet exited through the side of the filter at an angle, striking Webb in the forearm. Compound fracture. Career-ending wound. Command was furious. 2 soldiers maimed by unauthorized weapon modifications in a single week. Stern memos became direct orders. Any soldier found modifying weapons with automotive parts would face immediate court-martial. No exceptions, no appeals. The crackdown landed squarely on Jack Monroe's shoulders. Lieutenant Morrison, who had written the favorable report about suppressed fire being critical to mission success, was called to division headquarters and reprimanded. His report was pulled from official channels. The paper trail that might have pushed suppressor research up the chain of command vanished into a filing cabinet. Colonel Harrison summoned Jack to his command tent. The conversation was short and brutal. "Monroe, 2 soldiers are going home without fingers because of your invention. Sir, they built it wrong. They did not reinforce the welds. They did not. I do not care about the technical details. Men are getting hurt." Harrison's voice was controlled, but his jaw was tight. "I gave you permission to use your device. I did not give you permission to start an epidemic of backyard gunsmiths blowing their hands off." Jack stood at attention, feeling the weight of Torres's missing fingers, Webb's shattered forearm. The knowledge that his invention, his solution, was now causing the exact kind of harm he had built it to prevent. Bad equipment getting men hurt. But then Harrison said something unexpected. Which is why you are going to do this properly, sir. You are going to build 6 more. Correct specifications. Tested. Reliable. For MY squad leaders only. No distribution beyond that. No one else touches them. You build them, you test them, you train the men who use them. And if one more soldier gets hurt because of a faulty filter, I am holding you personally responsible. Understood? Yes, sir. Jack had 72 hours to build 6 functional suppressors from oil filters before the Indus River Bridge assault. 72 hours. 6 filters. Each one requiring 4 hours of careful welding, threading, packing, and assembly. 24 hours of straight fabrication work in a motor pool that also needed to keep an armored division's vehicles running. Big Mike found him at 0200 on the second night. Jack had not slept. His hands were burned from welding. His eyes were red from lamp fumes. 4 filters completed. 2 to go. Big Mike set down a cup of coffee and a sandwich. You look like death. Feel worse. How many done 4? Need 2 more by tomorrow night. Big Mike watched him work for a minute. Then he pulled up a stool, picked up a wrench, and started securing baffles on the 5th filter. Jack looked at him. You know how to do this? I watched you build the first one. Paid attention. Figured someone should know how, in case you catch a bullet. They worked through the night. 6 filters completed by dawn of the 3rd day. Each one tested. 5 rounds per filter to verify function, without burning through the limited lifespan. Each one producing that same heavy pneumatic cough. That same mechanical thud. The sound of silence weaponized. October 29th, 1944. The Indus River. 0030 hours. 12 Americans, plus Jack Monroe, making 13, moved through freezing rain toward the most heavily fortified bridge they had ever seen. The rail bridge was 400 feet long, steel and concrete construction, strong enough to carry locomotive traffic, strong enough to carry the 3rd Armored's heaviest tanks. German engineers had wired every support pylon with demolition charges, enough explosive to crater the riverbed itself. 26 defenders, 4 machine gun positions, trip flares everywhere. A listening post 300 meters out with a field telephone that could bring artillery on their heads in 90 seconds. Jack had distributed the 6 filters to Big Mike and 5 of his most experienced riflemen. Each man carried an M3 grease gun with a filter suppressor and a single 30-round magazine. 50 usable rounds per filter before failure. 300 suppressed rounds total for the entire squad. Against 26 Germans. The listening post had to die first. Jack and 2 men broke off from the main squad, crawled through mud for 45 minutes to reach the post. 2 Germans inside a shallow dugout covered with a tarp. Field telephone. Directional microphone on a tripod. 1 man wearing headphones listening for exactly the kind of approach the Americans were making. The other writing in a logbook. Jack was 10 feet away when the man with headphones suddenly stiffened. Held up his hand. He had heard something. A boot in mud. A belt buckle clicking. Something. He reached for the field telephone. Jack fired through the tarp. 2 rounds. Both Germans dropped. The telephone receiver fell off the hook and dangled on its cord, spinning slowly. The directional microphone recorded nothing but rain. Total noise generated by the suppressed weapon at 10 feet, approximately the sound of a car door closing. Main squad moved on the bridge. 6 men with suppressed grease guns spread across the approach. Trip flares marked with luminous paint by German engineers who never imagined the Americans would get close enough to see them. Big Mike's men stepped over the flares, between them, around them, silent as smoke. First sentry pair. Near end of the bridge. 2 Germans back to back. Big Mike took the one facing north. His rifleman took the one facing south. Simultaneous fire. 2 mechanical coughs. 2 bodies folding into the mud. The second pair never heard a thing. Second sentry pair. Midpoint. Jack took them both. 4 rounds. The filter was heating up. Smoke rising. 30 rounds left. Machine gun nest 1. 3 Germans, sandbags, tarp. 1 man awake behind the gun, 2 sleeping on ammunition crates. The awake one died first. Silent. The 2 sleepers never woke up. Machine gun nest 2. Same story. 3 more Germans eliminated without a single sound that carried beyond 50 yards. Machine gun nest 3 sat on the far abutment directly above the demolition bunker. 2 men, alert, nervous. They had heard the listening post go silent on the field telephone. They had tried to call twice. No answer. Something was wrong, and they knew it. One of them stood up behind the sandbags, pulled a signal flare from his belt. If he fired that flare, the bunker crew would detonate the bridge. Everything lost. Jack was 30 yards away. The filter was dying, smoke pouring from every vent, metal glowing. Maybe 3 rounds left. He could not miss. He fired. The filter made a sound louder than before, a harsh metallic bark. Not a gunshot, but not silent either. The German with the flare took the round in the throat, dropped the flare. It rolled across the bridge deck, did not ignite. His partner lunged for the signal flare on the ground. Big Mike's man fired from 20 yards. The German collapsed on top of the flare, pinning it under his body. Machine gun nest 4. The last defensive position. 2 Germans who had heard the metallic bark from nest 3. They were awake. Alert. Swinging the MG-42 toward the sound. Jack could see the barrel traversing. 5 seconds from opening fire and waking every German in the sector. 3 men fired simultaneously. 3 suppressed grease guns. 9 rounds. The machine gun nest went silent. 23 Germans eliminated. 3 remained in the demolition bunker. The squad stormed it, breached the door. 3 rounds from Jack's grease gun. The filter exploded on the 3rd shot. The canister split along the weld line, venting hot gas sideways. Metal fragments embedded in the bunker wall 6 inches from Jack's face. But the 3 Germans inside were already down. 26 defenders. 0 alarms raised. 0 demolition charges detonated. The bridge stood intact. The 3rd Armored crossed the Indie River before dawn. Tanks, half-tracks, artillery. The German defensive line behind the river collapsed within hours. The breakthrough opened a corridor 12 miles wide. Enemy units that had expected the bridge to blow found themselves flanked, surrounded, cut off. 400 German soldiers surrendered by noon. An entire battalion rendered combat ineffective because a rail bridge they assumed was safe had been taken by 13 Americans carrying truck parts. The impact rippled outward. After the Indie crossing, Colonel Harrison formally requested that Division Ordnance investigate noise suppression technology for infantry weapons. His report used careful language, did not mention oil filters, referenced field-expedient muzzle devices that demonstrated tactical value in bridge seizure operations. The report went to Corps Headquarters, then to Theater Command. By November 1944, ordnance officers at 3 separate research facilities were studying the physics of gas expansion chambers and baffle systems for small arms suppression. Casualty statistics told the larger story. In September 1944, before Jack Monroe built his first filter, American stealth assault missions in the 3rd Armored's sector suffered a 38% casualty rate. By November, after 3 bridge operations using suppressed weapons, that number had dropped to 9%. 4 times fewer casualties. 4 times more missions completed successfully. The math was undeniable, even if the method was unauthorized. The Germans adjusted again, pulled more troops from frontline positions. Bridge garrisons in the western sector grew to 40 and 50 soldiers. Defensive perimeters expanded to 500 meters. The Wehrmacht was hemorrhaging combat power into static defense, weakening the very lines the 3rd Armored was designed to break through. Every soldier standing guard on a bridge was one soldier not fighting in a trench. Jack Monroe's oil filters were draining German manpower without firing a single conventional shot. By December 1944, the principle had taken root in official channels. Ordnance researchers were designing purpose-built suppressors, using the same physics Jack had understood while lying under a truck. Expansion chambers, gas cooling, pressure reduction through sequential baffles. The engineering was more sophisticated. The materials were better, but the concept was identical. A mechanic from West Virginia had shown them what was possible. Now they were making it permanent. Jack Monroe never received a medal. The official records listed every bridge operation as standard infantry actions: knife attacks, speed, and surprise. The oil filters were never mentioned by name, but Harrison wrote one more note in Jack's personnel file. A single line that said everything the Army could not say publicly. Sergeant Monroe's technical innovations directly contributed to the success of multiple critical operations and the preservation of strategic infrastructure essential to divisional advance. It was not glory. It was not fame. It was a colonel's quiet admission that a mechanic had been right and the system had been wrong. But the war was not done with Jack Monroe. December 1944 brought something nobody expected: the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler's last desperate gamble. 200,000 German troops smashing through Allied lines in the Ardennes. The 3rd Armored Division caught in the path of the largest German offensive since 1940. And somewhere in that chaos, in the frozen forests and burning villages, Jack Monroe would face the one question his oil filters could not answer. What happens when silence is not enough? What happens when the enemy comes at you with everything they have and no invention, no ingenuity? No amount of stubbornness can stop the sheer weight of an army fighting for its survival. Part 4 is the final chapter. The one that decides whether Jack Monroe keeps his last promise. The one he made to Sarah. The one about coming home. That story begins in the snow, and it does not end the way you think. A mechanic from West Virginia built a silencer from a truck oil filter. The Army banned it. He used it anyway. Took 2 bridges without waking the guards. Saved an armored division's advance. Dropped American stealth mission casualties from 38% to 9%. Forced the Wehrmacht to pull 8,000 combat troops into static bridge defense. And quietly planted the seed that would grow into modern suppressor technology used by every special operations unit on Earth. But what happened to the man who started it all? What happened to Jack Monroe after the bridges were taken and the tanks rolled through, and the generals wrote their reports without mentioning his name? This story has one final chapter. The one almost nobody knows. Because the ending Jack Monroe got was not the ending he deserved. And the twist that connects his oil filter to every suppressed weapon carried by American soldiers today is something that stayed buried in classified files for over 50 years. Success sometimes comes with a price that does not show up on any receipt. December 1944. The Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge hit the Allied lines like a freight train made of 200,000 German soldiers. Hitler's last desperate gamble. A massive offensive designed to split the American and British armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace. The 3rd Armored Division was caught directly in the path of the German assault. Tanks, infantry, artillery, all smashing through positions that had been considered safe just hours before. Jack Monroe's motor pool was overrun on the 2nd day. No warning, no preparation. German panzer grenadiers came through the tree line at dawn while mechanics were still sleeping. Jack grabbed his grease gun, the one with the threaded barrel, but there was no filter attached. No time to screw one on. No need for silence when the entire forest was already exploding. He fought as infantry that day. A mechanic with a submachine gun firing from behind a burning half-track, trying to buy time for the division to reorganize. Big Mike Dawson was beside him, steady as always, directing fire, calling positions. The Chicago cop turned combat leader doing what he did best. A German mortar round landed 12 feet from their position. The blast threw Jack sideways into the mud. Shrapnel tore through his left leg below the knee. He felt heat before he felt pain, looked down and saw blood soaking through his uniform pants, dark and fast. Big Mike dragged him behind a stone wall, tied a tourniquet above the wound with hands that did not shake. "You are going home, Monroe." "The hell I am. You do not have a choice. Your leg is done." Jack Monroe was evacuated from the Ardennes on December 19, 1944. Loaded onto a stretcher, carried to an aid station, then to a field hospital, then to a transport ship crossing the Atlantic. The same route Tommy Sullivan had traveled 2 months earlier. The war was over for Jack Monroe. Not because he chose to leave, but because a piece of German steel made the choice for him. He arrived at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. on January 3, 1945. The doctors saved his leg, but the damage was permanent. Nerve damage below the knee, a limp he would carry for the rest of his life. He spent 4 months in rehabilitation, learning to walk again, writing letters to Sarah, holding the photograph of baby Margaret that his wife had sent in November. A daughter he had never held. A family waiting in West Virginia. Jack Monroe received an honorable discharge in May 1945. The same week, Germany surrendered. He came home on a Tuesday afternoon. Sarah was on the porch. Margaret was in her arms. 14 months old. Dark eyes. Stubborn chin. Jack dropped his duffel bag, climbed the steps with his bad leg aching, and held his daughter for the first time. She studied his face with serious eyes, memorizing the stranger who smelled like hospital soap and old canvas. He reopened Monroe Auto Repair that summer. Hung the same sign his father had made. "If it is broke, we fix it." He worked alone for the first year, then hired a kid from town, then another. The garage grew slowly, steadily, built on the same reputation Robert Monroe had established. Honest work, fair prices, fix anything that rolls through the door. Tommy Sullivan visited in the spring of 1946, walking with a slight limp of his own. Married, expecting his first child. They sat on Jack's porch drinking beer while Margaret chased fireflies in the yard. Tommy told Jack he had named his son Jack Sullivan Jr. "So everyone knows who saved me." Jack did not talk about the bridges, did not talk about the oil filters, did not talk about the Ardennes or the shrapnel or the months in Walter Reed. When customers asked about the war, he said he had been a mechanic, fixed trucks, kept the army rolling. All true, just not the whole truth. He never received a medal. The official records listed every bridge operation as standard infantry actions. The oil filters were never mentioned. But Harrison's notation remained in Jack's personnel file. That single line about technical innovation and mission success. A colonel's quiet admission buried in paperwork that nobody would read for decades. But the legacy Jack Monroe left behind was not measured in medals or commendations. It was measured in physics. In 1957, the United States Navy's China Lake Research Facility began a classified program studying improvised noise suppression devices for covert operations in Southeast Asia. Navy researchers tested automotive oil filters as disposable suppressors, documenting their performance characteristics with scientific precision. The results confirmed what Jack Monroe had discovered 13 years earlier in a German motor pool. Standard truck oil filters, when properly reinforced, could suppress muzzle blast by approximately 60 to 70% for 40 to 60 rounds before thermal failure. The mesh baffles disrupted the pressure wave. The cotton packing absorbed heat and slowed gas expansion. The cylindrical housing contained the expanding gases long enough to reduce the acoustic signature below the threshold of identification at distances greater than 100 meters. The physics were sound. The engineering was crude, and the Navy's conclusion was identical to what Jack had learned on the Rower River Bridge. It works, but it is too unreliable for standard issue. So they built something better. In the 1960s, military engineers designed purpose-built suppressors using the same principle. Expansion chambers machined from aircraft-grade aluminum. Heat-resistant baffles made from stainless steel instead of mesh screen. Sealed housings that could withstand thousands of rounds instead of 50. The designs evolved through Vietnam, where Navy SEALs carried suppressed weapons on operations that required the same silence Jack Monroe had needed on those German bridges. Through the Gulf War, through Afghanistan and Iraq. Each generation of suppressor more sophisticated, more reliable, more effective. But every single one of them based on the same physics a mechanic understood while lying under a truck, staring at an oil filter. Today, over 40 nations issue suppressed weapons to their military forces. The global military suppressor market exceeds $2 billion annually. The United States Special Operations Command considers suppressed fire a standard tactical capability, not a specialty. Every Marine rifle squad has access to suppressors. Every special operations team carries them as standard equipment. The technology that Jack Monroe proved with garage trash is now as fundamental to modern warfare as body armor or night vision. The numbers tell the story that metals never did. Military researchers estimate that suppressed weapons have contributed to a 60% reduction in casualties during stealth operations since their widespread adoption in the 1980s. Thousands of soldiers alive today because someone proved that silence was possible. That muzzle blast could be tamed. That the physics of gas expansion applied to guns the same way they applied to truck engines. But the biggest lesson Jack Monroe taught the world was not about baffles or gas expansion or weld integrity. It was about who gets to innovate. In 1944, the United States Army believed that weapon design belonged to trained engineers in approved laboratories. The chain of command determined what equipment soldiers carried. Regulations governed what modifications were permitted. The system was built on the assumption that the people at the top knew best, that a sergeant in a motor pool could not possibly understand something that PhD engineers had not already considered. Jack Monroe proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. Not because he was smarter than the engineers. He was not. But because he was closer to the problem. He had carried Tommy Sullivan out of a forest. He had watched 3 men die because a Thompson was too loud. He had felt the blood soak through his uniform and made a promise to a widow. The engineers in Washington had reports. Jack Monroe had scars. History is full of similar stories. Percy Spencer, a self-taught engineer with no college degree, invented the microwave oven in 1945 after noticing a radar set had melted a chocolate bar in his pocket. Barnes Wallis, an aircraft designer dismissed by military leadership as impractical, invented the bouncing bomb that destroyed the Ruhr dams in 1943. Sergeant Curtis Grubb, Cullen, a hedgerow cutter inventor from New Jersey, welded steel teeth onto Sherman tanks from beach obstacles in Normandy, solving the bocage problem that had stalled the entire Allied advance. None of these men were supposed to innovate. All of them changed history because they refused to accept that expertise only flows from the top down. The lesson applies far beyond military history. Every industry, every organization, every institution has Jack Monroe's. People closest to the problem who see solutions invisible to leadership. Mechanics who understand engines better than the engineers who designed them. Nurses who see treatment failures before the doctors do. Factory workers who know why the assembly line keeps breaking. The question is whether the system listens to them or laughs at them, the way Lieutenant Morrison laughed at Jack Monroe's oil filter. And there is one final detail that almost nobody knows. In 2003, the National Archives declassified a batch of World War II ordnance reports from the European Theater of Operations. Among them was a document dated November 12, 1944, written by Lieutenant James Morrison, Ordnance Officer, 3rd Armored Division. The report that Morrison had told Jack he would write. The one about suppressed fire being critical to bridge seizure operations. The report had been pulled from official channels in October 1944 after the unauthorized weapon modification injuries. It was supposed to have been destroyed. Instead, someone had filed it in the wrong cabinet where it sat untouched for 59 years. The report contained a single paragraph that Morrison had never told Jack about, a recommendation buried at the bottom of page 3. It is the recommendation of this officer that Sergeant Jack R. Monroe, Motor Pool, Section 3rd Armored Division, be recognized for exceptional technical innovation under combat conditions. Sergeant Munro's improvised muzzle suppression device, constructed from standard automotive components, demonstrated tactical capabilities that significantly exceeded expectations and directly contributed to the successful seizure of strategically critical infrastructure. This officer further recommends that Sergeant Munro's design principles be forwarded to the Ordnance Department for formal evaluation and potential standardization. Morrison had not just written a vague report about suppressed fire. He had put Jack Munro's name in an official document, had recommended him by name for recognition, had asked the United States Army to study what Jack had built and turn it into standard equipment. The report never reached the people who could act on it, but Morrison had tried. The man who had laughed loudest at Jack's first failure had become his strongest advocate in writing. Jack Munro never knew. Morrison was killed in action during the Battle of the Bulge 3 weeks after writing that report. He never had the chance to tell Jack what he had done. Jack Munro died in his sleep in 1988 at 74 years old. A heart attack. Quick. Painless. His family found a trunk in the attic, uniform, letters, photographs, a rusted threaded washer that had once connected an oil filter to a grease gun barrel. They did not know what it was. They threw it away. But the story survived. From a mechanic in a motor pool with an idea everyone called insane to a technology used by over 40 nations and credited with saving thousands of lives across 8 decades of modern warfare, Jack Munro proved that innovation does not require a laboratory or a degree or permission from the chain of command. It requires a problem, a pile of scrap, and a man stubborn enough to build what needs building when nobody else will. 50 rounds, 6 kills on the Rower Bridge, 26 kills on the Ind Crossing, 2 bridges seized intact, 1 armored division's advance preserved. Casualties on stealth missions reduced from 38% to 9%. And a promise to a coal miner's widow kept on a rainy night in Germany with a piece of garage trash that changed the way wars are fought. The experts said it was impossible. The officers said it was forbidden. The regulations said it was unauthorized. Jack Munro said it was necessary, and he was right. If you know a story like this, an ordinary person who built something extraordinary when nobody believed it could work, share it in the comments. Because history is full of Jack Munros, mechanics farmers, factory workers, people with grease under their fingernails who saw what the experts missed and had the courage to act on it. These are the stories worth telling. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Wars are not won by generals in headquarters or engineers in laboratories. Wars are won by sergeants in motor pools who look at a pile of junk and see a solution. Who make promises and keep them. Who build what needs building no matter what the rulebook says. Jack Munro kept every promise he made. To his father's memory, to Margaret Sullivan, to Tommy, to Sarah, to 12 men on a bridge in the dark. He did it with an oil filter, a welding torch, and a heart that refused to quit. That is the most dangerous weapon ever built. Not the silencer. The stubbornness of a good man who will not let his people die. Remember that. Because somewhere right now in a garage or a workshop or a factory floor, another Jack Munro is staring at a problem everyone says cannot be solved. And if history teaches us anything, it is this. Never bet against the mechanic.